Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 188 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. I have our regular special guest every other Friday, Lynn. She is a geopolitical analyst, historian, and author. And I left my phone in the other room, and I can't do my show without my phone. So I'm going to have to take a really quick break. I'm going to be right back. I apologize, everyone. Hold on one sec.
Well, then I will hold down the fort. Good morning to everybody. We're glad that you're joining us either live or later on our recording. And we've got what I just feel to be a very important topic that all of us need to be aware of. And I think it's going to help your understanding. All right. I held the fort, Billy Bob.
Yeah, I apologize for the amateur hour starting our stream without having my necessary phone next to me. But yeah, super important topic. When we talk about the ideological struggle, the ideological warfare that takes place, just the historical mythology that is just indoctrinated into everyone is insidious. And if you don't know what the reality of history is, you're kind of lost. You're kind of confused because you don't know where we've been. You don't know where we're at. So how can you, have a good idea about where we need to go? And so it's important to have a solid historical understanding to just, know where we're at in the present, like what is going on now. And then we can really try and figure out how to move forward. So Stalin, the 20th century, definitely one of the greatest, if not the greatest heroes of the 20th century. And I think we're gonna do a program just on deconstructing all the myths and the lies about Stalin. That's not necessarily what we're gonna do today. We're gonna try and get into Stalin's character, who he was as a person, and not so much on the lies, but we'll do a whole show about that. So our title today is Stalin, His True Character Revealed. So, and I know, Christine, you've done a lot of work on this topic and you've written articles. Can you tell us, your expertise results from certain sources. So what kind of sources are you using when we enter into this discussion about Stalin's character?
Well, for this discussion, I want us to focus upon his character revealed through personal encounters with people. And as Billy Bob just explained, he and I are going to do another show addressing all of the evil, dark lies that have been told about Stalin. Probably many in our audience are aware of that. There may be some who are going to be hearing us talk about these personal anecdotes and encounters from memoirs and diaries. I think it's very important that people that were subordinate to someone, worked for someone, what they had to say about them. I think that reveals aspects of someone's character that you're not going to necessarily get from the public persona. However, in regards to those massive lies about him being, a brutal tyrant and killing tens of millions or whatever number they want to say of people, or that entire false thing about the Holodomor. These are major lies that were meant to discredit Stalin, and they did a fine job of it. But none of them, I can tell you as a historian, are true. And Billy Bob and I are going to address those specifically in another show. As he said, this is going to focus upon the personal encounters. And I've read so many memoirs, Billy Bob, of soldiers, of generals, of citizens, civilians who wrote or kept diaries at the time during the war. For example, people who worked for him, his bodyguards, various people, and also many American journalists, British journalists as well, who actually came and stayed there for lengths of time or interviewed those or spent time with Stalin themselves. And I think that these books are quite revealing. Some of them are even, as we would say, people you might assume might have a hostility, or did, not all of them, towards Stalin. Some had been imprisoned for, some mistakes that they had made, and then rehabilitated. And so what we're talking about, not people who are trying to, and this came after the fact. There's no personal gain from them simply sharing their experiences, their personal encounters with Stalin. And I think through that, we get a glimpse of the man that is completely opposite. And toward that, I'd like to share a quote from Davies. He was the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union at the time. He was appointed by FDR. And I really like this quote. This was in his book, Mission to Moscow. And I think I'd like to begin our show with this quote. And I'm quoting from Joseph Davies. Stalin has a sly humor. He has a very great mentality. It is sharp, shrewd, and above all else, wise. If you can picture a personality that is exactly opposite to what the most rabid anti-Stalinist anywhere could conceive, then you might picture this man. And again, that's from Mission to Moscow. And I think that summarizes everything we're going to share today. And I would ask that as we share some of these personal anecdotes people had with Stalin, contrast it to the Western leaders of today, or any Western leader at any time, or the Tsar when you look back preceding Stalin. Just keep in your mind the things you're going to learn about Stalin as a man from people's personal experiences with him, and contrast that, because what you're going to find is a man of deep humility, and I would say that's what led to his wisdom, compassion, and strength. And listen through the whole show, and you might just be surprised on what type of man he was. I'm not surprised. I've read so many books, but that's what I'd like us to delve into, an assessment of his character from those who knew him.
So let's start off, Christine, talking about his relationship with the military and with the common soldier. So, again, the Western narratives are that, he was brutal, ruthless, and he just, these human wave attacks, and the life of the soldier was meaningless to him. And, everything was about, maintaining power, and he didn't care what the cost was, kind of thing. So can you tell us a little bit about how Stalin regarded the common soldier?
Yes, I would have to say from multiple memoirs that I've read, I would have to say he deeply cared about every soldier, his well-being, and his life. I will give you a few examples. Troop exhaustion was something that was extremely important to him. Now, there are recorded, Zhukov in his book, Reminiscences and Reflections, recalled how Stalin was always wanting reports on not only the positions and the maps of the troops, but on their physical exhaustion. And he would actually want them to, order them to be regrouped so that they could rest. Rokossovsky, in his book, he talked about how much emphasis he put on it. I'd like to give you a quote from A Soldier's Duty from his book. Stalin demanded that attacks be prepared carefully and that lives not be squandered without necessity. The attacks were never for, let's say, symbolism or I would say deadline driven. He would really analyze, and because every soldier, from numerous reports, I would also say, I even remember personal anecdotes and some of those who worked for Stalin, and they were in the military. And when they reported to him, I read 2 or 3 of these, they themselves were exhausted. Sometimes have been going a few days, without rest. And yet they were called to the Kremlin to report to Stalin. And he would notice and actually talk to them about that. And sometimes he didn't order them to rest, and other times he actually did, or else they regretted that they didn't and then asked for it. The well-being of the soldiers was very important. I would also like to give you an example that I think really speaks to his character in regards to soldiers and his personal integrity, was when his son Yakov was captured by the Germans, Billy Bob, and very sad, very early in the war, July of 41, I believe he was captured, surrounded, and captured by the Germans. So Stalin's son being held as a prisoner of war. And there's a couple memoirs, anyway, that I remember referenced his being communicated that the Germans would exchange Marshal Paulus for his son. And later, this is much later, after they had captured Paulus, and that it really weighed heavily on him. I remember reading passages from people who said you could just tell how heavy it was on his heart, on his mind, to know that his son was captured. But yet, he would not make that exchange. I mean, it just shows you he declined that exchange. There were various persons, and I paraphrase, saying, they heard him express that all Red Army soldiers are my sons. How can I choose one? Is one more important than another? What would that mean toward all of the others? And in fact, Montefiore, he's a British journalist, in his book, The Court of the Red Tsar, he said, he made a quote, "Who would swap them for Paulus? Were they worse than Yakov? I had no right." It just speaks to Stalin, even with his own son. He wasn't going to do such a prisoner exchange because he respected all of the Red Army soldiers. And I just think it's, a tragic but a very clear example of his character. There's another thing that I wanted to share with our audience, and I think it really speaks to when something's important to you, you remember it. And I was really impressed with how many people talked about Stalin's memory in regard to what we're talking about in regard to the soldiers. And it really didn't matter whether it was front commanders or even just lower personnel. He would remember their names. And I'm going to give you a quote because it's from, I think, what's that? Lifelong Calls. This is from Vasilevsky, and he was the Marshal of the Soviet Union. He was the chief of the general staff. And this is from his book about how important the names of everyone who served under Stalin. And he said it was a phenomenal memory. Long periods of time could go by, but he would remember, quote, "I have never met anyone who could remember as much. He knew by name all the army and front commanders, and even the names of some corps and divisional commanders. Throughout the war, Stalin had the composition of the strategic reserves in his head." And I think that very much speaks to it. It's not the only reference that I've seen of that. But when you care about someone, and when you care about your troops and your generals, you will remember their names. You will remember detail. It showed just how important it was to him. And lastly, in regards to the troops, I would tell you there were so many encounters that I read about Billy Bob in which he showed compassion and forgiveness. There would be those who had made mistakes from, let's just say, in their service, or maybe making some mistakes with who they got involved with and turning out to be working for the Germans. I remember one of those incidents, but all different types where somebody had a dereliction, a mistake in their duty, and then being called to see Stalin. And overwhelmingly, at least the ones that I read, they always thought they were going to be severely punished. And instead, sometimes they would have to wait a few hours to see Stalin, but when they did, he would give them a chance to talk. He would listen, and he would just simply listen. And in their minds and their memoirs, they're afraid of what's going to happen. And then he would simply, and I'm paraphrasing from the Bible where it says, "Go and sin no more," when Jesus said that to the woman. Well, essentially, Stalin would say that to people. They would make mistakes. They were in fear of what was going to happen. And yet he would forgive them. And he was just like, learn from your mistakes. And that was how I would have to say he treated the soldiers. He treated the generals very forgiving. He simply wanted accountability. This is from Albert Axel's book, Stalin's War. And he is actually making a quote, I believe, from Marshal Rudenko. Quote, "I thought I would be severely punished, but Stalin listened to my report, and instead of punishment, I got a promotion. Everything Zhukov said about Stalin giving you a chance to explain your side is true. And again, this is said over and over by so many anecdotes like that. And again, it just, every single one of these points to the caring that he had for the soldiers. Soldiers' life was important to him. Also, I will share this. I've read of several where Stalin himself, and we'll get into some of these things that he had done for families later. But when he received millions of letters to the Kremlin during the war, and I'm going to separate, the ones from the family needs, but sometimes he would receive letters from the troops and the soldiers about their families and about their families' needs. And Stalin himself would, place orders for provision, for relocation. But Stalin also, on numerous occasions, is the impression I get from some of the memoirs, it was noted that he would be sending money to families of the soldiers, and even letting, as if their son had been sending it to them. I just remember different encounters like that, and it just showed he very much cared about his troops.
It doesn't really, that what you're saying doesn't really agree with, the caricature that we get in the West, of course, of a brutal dictator murdered 27 million of his own people. What about his commanders? So you kind of spoke to that a little bit, but I mean, again, the West, we just have this understanding that he dictated things, he dictated military strategy, and it always messed up. Like, he didn't know what he was doing, but he forced his own method, his own thoughts and his own strategies against the will of the actual military officials, and it didn't usually work out. Like, that's like a bumbling evil dictator is how they present. So what's the reality?
Well, that's a completely false image. And of course, when you make reference to that 27 million, we will address that, but all those lies. But yes, this image of Stalin as like a solitary dictator, without regards to other persons, and without regards to the repercussions of what his orders were, is in direct opposition to all of the testimonies of those who worked with him. What I come away from it was, he was a man who listened and he debated, but he always relied, I would say, on that collective judgment, even when it disagreed with his. I'm going to quote Zhukov again from the book. Quote, Stalin listened carefully. And he also said that often he would hear Stalin saying, "You know this better than I do." There was also a lady, Anne Louise Strong. Yes, she's an American journalist. I think this is important. She was just one of several American journalists, but her description also matches, I would say, Mekyan, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, various Soviet leaders, generals. And in her book, which as the Soviets expected it, a few quotes from it. I found him the easiest person to talk to I ever met, a superlative good committee man. He does not thrust himself into the picture. And this is, like I said, the anecdotes that I'm sharing are just a few. I would literally, and I'm not exaggerating, of hundreds. So again and again, you see a man who listened and considered. There's a book that actually I only recently read from the leader of Albania at the time, Enver Hoxha, and his book. And I really only read this maybe about 3 weeks ago or something, 2 or 3 weeks ago. But it's a really good book, small book, and it was called With Stalin. And from that book, he never gave orders. This is my opinion. You must judge and decide for yourselves. And he went on to talk about how much he listened. We get a picture of a man who listened, considered, and had discussion. Humility seemed to oversee everything that Stalin did. And I would also add, as I did earlier, there were British, there were Americans, there's W.E. Du Bois. Henry Wallace, the vice president of the U.S., actually commented upon how well and easy and the humility, so to speak, of Stalin. So no, I would just say that everything to the contrary of what people think about him and infer from the lies that they've told. And that's why I think it's so important that you get a few of these personal glimpses. But no, as a commander, I mean, as the ultimate commander, as the general secretary, he listened to everybody and then made the decisions. And sometimes even if that more of them felt one way, he would go with that. So no, a very humble man as a leader. It's hard to say the word humble and leader in the world we live in today, but Stalin certainly was.
Order number 227. I skipped that. That was the one that was like the West has made a lot out of, like shooting people who were, retreating. And it's like, can you explain that and contextualize order number 227 for us?
Sure, I'll be glad to. It is also referred to as the not one step back policy, and it occurred in July of 1942, which, as anyone who's studied the terrible assault of the Germans in Operation Barbarossa, by the time of July 42, it was during the worst phase of the German invasion, and this order forbade unauthorized retreat. And for any soldiers who would retreat from the front line, they could be facing penal battalions. They were blocking detachments there. And yes, it could also result in being shot at the time. And the reason why Order 227 was made, I thought a lot about this, but in the study of it, the Red Army had to hold those positions. And so having this backup, and most of them were not shot. Most of them actually were taken to the penal battalions and then brought back to the front lines, and they were returned, the vast majority. And by 1944, the order was no longer in effect. But this was issued at a moment of existential collapse. The Germans were advancing towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus, and we had already suffered catastrophic losses at this point, and there had been mass retreats, which made it worse. And Stalin looked at this in that if one man or any man, any man, had failed his duty, he could condemn hundreds of other soldiers just because he did not stand his ground. Then it couldn't result in hundreds of other soldiers dying and even thousands of civilians, because you could not lose that front. Collapse would cause much more death, and that was one of those, I would say, heavy decisions that Stalin had to make. But for the sake of Russia, for the sake of all the Red soldiers and all of the civilians, it had to be made to ensure the standing of the front line. Otherwise, hundreds, if not thousands, would die if you allowed people to retreat.
And it's hard for Westerners like myself who live in a suburb and have known nothing but peace and prosperity to even imagine and contemplate what it would be like, being the leader of a country that's facing the largest military invasion in the history of the known universe, predicated on really genocide and taking over the land and occupying it, and for your master race. I mean, it doesn't get any more diabolical than that. And so when you're facing that, and millions and millions of your countrymen are being murdered and killed by this aggression, by this racist imperialist aggression, we got to just keep that context in mind with these orders, and it's really easy to appeal to the lack of contextual understanding in Western minds and say, oh, look how awful that was, what Stalin did. And yeah, if you contextualize it and you put yourself in his shoes, it makes sense. Like it's a tough decision, but like you said, you're ultimately saving more lives in the process, and that was the impetus for that law. So So yeah, how did Stalin respond to civilian suffering and atrocities?
Okay. Well, the we'll address the suffering of the people after we discuss the atrocities. And what so deeply impresses me about Stalin is that he viewed criminal behavior, criminals as criminals, regardless if they wore the enemy's uniform or if they wore a Soviet uniform. And when atrocities were committed by either side, the righteous indignation, the bearing need for justice is what we see evinced in Stalin's actions. So I'm first of all going to talk about it from the Soviet side. Now, first of all, I'm going to qualify this and say that and this may be one of the lies Billy Bob and I will address in greater detail in another show. But there is a lie about the Soviet soldiers and rape. And as if they were more feared, and well, they may have been more feared, but that was need not be feared versus some of the other allies. And the reason I say that, and we will address those lies, but I would first of all want to dispel that before I tell you some of these facts about what Stalin did, because in no way am I corroborating or agreeing with in any way those lies about our Great Red Army. And for anyone who's curious about that, there's a professor that I've read, Professor Elena Sinyavskaya. She is a Russian historian, and she's really studied this and dispelled all of these lies about the actions as we overcame the enemy and entered Germany. But now, Stalin had issued orders that anyone who did engage in such evil behavior as rape was actually called for the execution. In the Red Army, you were disgraced, any kind of behavior like that. Unlike, I have to say, and the way some of the allies acted, this was no joking matter. This wasn't something that the good old boys do. This was really looked down upon. And from the highest, I would say, Stalin went so far, he issued explicit orders that during combat, any type of behavior like that was a moral disgrace to the Red Army as a whole. And yes, there were persons who simply were arrested, but there were also executions. We do know that it was punishable by death, and it was enforced. And that comes from the highest leadership. He was disgusted by that. But I will again have to go back, since I'm mentioning this, because I'm going to also mention the atrocities of the enemy. He just did not stand for any atrocities, any evil that was committed by the troops themselves. Next of all, though, I want to talk about some of the atrocities that really brought Stalin to just, I've read in some memoirs, those observing him, he was furious when he learned about some of the disgusting atrocities, the evil that was committed by the Waffen SS. And anyone not familiar with them, they were the ideological side of the Nazis. And unlike the common German soldier, the Waffen SS committed such atrocities, mass murders of civilians, women, and children, locking them in buildings and churches and burning them alive. I've read of the torture of when they captured any of our female Red Army soldiers. They are the worst human beings that have existed in the Waffen SS, some of the atrocities. And he regarded Stalin, and again, this filtered all the way from Stalin down to the generals and the way the Waffen SS would be treated, especially details that they knew correlated with villages that they had burned and massacred all of the women and children. Those persons were only looked at as criminals, and no, they were not looked at as prisoners of war at that point because of the atrocities that had been committed. And they could be shot on sight, and they were shot on sight. Now, there were many who were also taken prisoner, especially near the end of the war. There were young people who had not participated in that. They were taken captured, though they were always kept separate from other German prisoners of war. They were always regarded as perpetrators of criminal behavior, not lawful combatants. And I always admired that about Stalin and about the way the Red Army treated them, because these people to me cease in a way to be human. They're human beings, but they're so demonic in the activities that they had done. I would also like to say that this was justified because at Nuremberg, they were also found to be committed war crimes and criminality. They were actually declared a criminal organization. So I would say that he had a strong sense of justice, and I admire that, whether it was to protect from anything his soldiers might do. And toward that, I cannot even touch this subject without saying this when we start talking about sexualized violence. Those lies about the Red Army, though of course all of the armies, all of the Allied armies, involved, that happens, which is a tragic part of war. It's a disgusting part of war. That happens when you have this many men, soldiers under these conditions. But the lies about the Red Army came from Joseph Goebbels, and it was great for the U.S. thereafter, after the war ended, to play up those lies about the Red Army's behavior, which are just the opposite. And you and I will explore that sometime because it's just the opposite of the truth. Stalin demanded good behavior, and yes, it was punished if it wasn't. And he most certainly exacted justice against the Waffen SS or others who committed atrocities. I really respected that. What was the second part of your question?
How did Stalin regard the suffering of Soviet children and families? We touched on that a little.
Right, we touched on it a little bit. He frequently read the letters, as I said, and of course he couldn't read all of the letters that were sent to the Kremlin. The General Secretariat did, but a number of them we can estimate very easily. There were hundreds of letters over the course of the war that he read from people needing help and telling him the situation with their children, and he would intervene and sometimes get families relocated. Also, there was a main push, the Soviet Union during the war, for new orphanages in safer places, because there were so many orphans, unfortunately, sadly, that were being made because their parents had died. There was also mass evacuations of families and many children east of the Urals. So children were precious, and the Soviet Union knew it. Stalin knew it. I would also say his general attitude toward children, which is he was very protective of children, not only in the policies of the Soviet Union and the help to them, but I would say he rejected the idea of the use of children for propaganda, which we so often see. It's just an anecdote, but I remember there was a book that was had been written called Tales of Stalin's Childhood or something like that. And they brought it to him because they had to get his approval, and he was disgusted by it. He called the book, and was it Rittersporn? Yeah, and from Rittersporn, in his book, he quoted Stalin as saying, "This is dangerous and harmful. I recommend you burn the book." And it's interesting because this was completely against. He did not want that self-glorification, which we'll get into in terms of people's experiences with him. But when it came to children, he wasn't going to have children and propagandize his image to them. I would just overall say he was very protective of children. I remember, and this again, it's just an anecdote, but it was very interesting. I forget which commander was in his office at the time, but the phone rang. And I just don't remember which commander it was, but it was in one of the memoirs. Stalin took the phone call, and it turned out that somehow in the Kremlin, the telephone numbers had been mismatched. And on the phone was a little girl, young child, and she was trying to reach her father in the Kremlin because she had a problem with her homework. And and that he said he watched Stalin. He could just hear Stalin's side of it, and his father, well, your father's not here right now. What's the problem? And then he got a pen, and then he started talking to her and walking her through, I think, a math problem and explaining it to her. Took much time with her and detailed, and then ended the phone call. Now, that's an anecdote, but it just shows you, I think nobody's going to know that. It's not going to be reported. There aren't journalists in the room. We don't know about this until years later, but it shows you that gentleness and that caring. I remember his daughter in her book, she also talked about that, but we'll get into that. If you'd like to talk about his private life, we can talk a little bit about, some of his personal aptitudes and how he lived his life. I think that these are some really clear examples. Would you like to get into that?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, who was Stalin in his private life? What kind of man was he away from authority and command?
Okay, well, I'm going to first tell you that these are just personal things about him. He enjoyed chess, and he loved fishing and hunting. He was a constant reader. So many recommend. He had thousands of books, and they're all written in. When you look at the books, you can actually read his notes in the on the book pages, which I find fascinating, because those comments as you're reading, especially when you're reading Dostoevsky and you see what Stalin and his own comments, agree or disagree, he would be writing his thoughts there. Read constantly. He had a fascination with geography. He loved singing Christian hymns. So, these were just some of his personal, but in terms of the way that he lived, what really impressed me was that so many talked about he had a life of simplicity. A lot of people talked about, you could even call it ascetic simplicity. And the reason I say that is he always wore very simple clothing. He refused when they would prepare uniforms that were ornate, maybe for a special occasion. He was just disgusted. Get that out of here. What is it for? I think, I forget the quote, but one time he referred to a uniform they made. What is this for? A peacock? He did not want to separate himself from the people. He would say there were awards they wanted to give to him, and he would say, "No, I never held a rifle. That's for a soldier. That's not for me." So you just see this humility. He ate very simply as well. Often in most of his meals, it was simple as any Russian would, with some boiled meat, soup, buckwheat, fruit and vegetables. Nothing compared to that which was obviously available to him. I'd like to give you a quote verbatim from Henri Barbusse in his book, Stalin. And I found this very interesting. Many people now, when I give you such a quote, there were many people who visited, whether it was his small, very small apartment at the Kremlin, which they kept on urging him to have something more ornate and built for him. And he was like, "This is enough for myself and my son." And same with his dacha. It was so simply furnished. And it just shows that austerity, that humility. A quote again from Barbusse: "The bedrooms are as simply furnished as those of a respectable second-class hotel." Various observations. He has only one secretary, and I liked this. He really emphasized this throughout the book. Stalin systematically gives credit for all progress made to Lenin, and of course, you and I know Zhukov and Medvedev and Bullock. They all would talk about that as well. He was a pupil of Lenin, and he would completely reject the idea of disciples for himself. Again, from Barbusse about his clothing, the dress of a private soldier. And Barbusse was like a French journalist at the time. And his book, Stalin, A New World Seen Through One Man. Good book. Even Khrushchev. I'm going to mention Khrushchev as much as I reject that evil, lying man. He, though, it's very interesting, again, as I said, when you have what I consider, like a hostile witness, if you will, certainly no friend of Stalin's. After Stalin's death, we see who the true Khrushchev was. But even he talked about Stalin was indifferent to appearance. Zhukov, he never tolerated luxury in clothing or life. And I think that shows, real humility. Zhukov also talked about Twice he was able to call Stalin a genius. The first time he was severely reprimanded for it. Stalin didn't want anyone referring to him that way. The second time was in Zhukov's eulogy for Stalin, that he was able to call him a genius. And I just contrast that with the arrogance of Western leaders, really mostly at all times. But I cannot help but think about the disgusting person, president of the United States now, and the arrogance when you contrast it with a great leader, a wise leader. Of course, he was a man. He made mistakes and he knew it, and he would admit that and seek the help of those around him. But he resisted honors. He resisted fully any type of, development of a cult image. And that's what impresses me. I am sorry. I attributed that was Molotov in the eulogy, and Molotov, who had called him a genius in one of the speeches, and he was reprimanded, and the only other time that he was able to call him a genius was after his death. His children also spoke of, he really did, I read some of the conversations, particularly the daughter, because she has a book and she did a lot of interviews, but also one of his sons, and talked about the conversations he would have them about their growing, about them becoming adults, about what was important to them, about the priorities they needed to have in their life. And speaking of the frugality of his life, even though he could have so much, Molotov recalled that Stalin owned no special formal clothes and was buried in his old repaired military uniform. And that was Shuev, Felix, and Molotov remembers. Stalin was very frugal. I think that these personal encounters show us so much about the man. Simple, really almost ascetic. He did everything to ensure the Soviet Union developed to the benefit of the people, and he did not separate himself from the people themselves and their suffering. He suffered when they suffered, and I really truly believe that, and that is extraordinary to see in a leader. And so I just say it's a great contrast. This is what a leader should be. And I think so, not only from his military leading, listening to others, learning from one's mistakes, but also how he treated everybody with respect. And that is what a leader should do, regardless of rank, regardless of whether you can do anything for him. He truly cared about people, and that's a sign of true humility. That's true love for your people.
When he passed away, was there, I've read things about his entire belongings, like his entire estate, so to speak, included like a few hundred, Russian dollars and,
yes,
a couple pairs of boots and a couple uniforms. Like, was the extent of his, the property that he owned?
Yeah, personal belongings were not important to him. And to me, that is a sign of, that to me is greatness, that kind of humility. He only wanted that which he needed, that which was adequate. And I think it's time that I would like to say, because this is what I'm devoted to in my life, and I know that you are, and that is why we're doing, multiple. We did one on his beliefs and was he a Christian before, and we're doing this one on the personal glimpses, and we're going to address those big lies as well. But to me, the quote attributed to him more or less by different people, having heard it, but I will give this paraphrase of it from Stalin. I know that after my death, a pile of rubbish will be heaped on my grave, but the wind of history will sooner or later sweep it away without mercy. Now, again, you'll see various translations or persons referencing that. We don't have the exact, but the idea is certainly consistent with what we know of Stalin. He knew that there was that hatred and betrayal, and those who were disloyal, traitors amongst them at all times. And yet, I would say it was because of his humility that he had the strength also to stand up to that and do what was necessary. You know, people call him brutal. I call him ruthless. And to be ruthless is a very good word. You have to be ruthless when you have evil human beings, demonic human beings, intent on destroying the government that you have made. And that is why there is so much lying propaganda about him as a man and what people are supposed to assume about him and about him as a leader. He became the prime target of lies because his society, it was the perfect example to the world of communism in action, and the entire world was attracted to it. And I think even those that realize that should also know that as a man, like the things we are discussing today, that goodness pervaded everything that he did. And that's my perception of him.
He tried to, he offered his resignation multiple times, right? Which again kind of flies in the face of this idea that, you know, he was a power hungry dictator who murdered everybody because he felt threatened by them, you know.
Correct. 4 times, and they would not let him leave. He was so loved by the people. But no, they couldn't let him go. They knew how important it was, not only, you know, the leadership and the military, but the people's trust in him. And he really developed the trust, you know. And you take a look at his death, you know, hundreds of thousands in attendance. Watch the films of those coming. Nobody has to do that. Nobody's ordered to do that. And you take a look at their faces and those tears. Stalin was beloved by the people. And I will tell you this, although a very divisive topic today in Russia, I'm very happy to see that the truth and the resurgence of the appreciation of Stalin is growing stronger and stronger. Frankly, I would almost say it may be a division, almost maybe 50-50 in the country right now in terms of wanting, and I certainly do, him to be even more greatly honored again. And we're coming up on May 9th. It would be so good that Stalin's name, who led us through the Great Patriotic War and who built society before and thereafter out of the ruins with such achievements that no other country could compare to the rapidity of the achievement that he gave. And the Russia we have today, the Russian Federation, beautiful Russian Federation, we would not have today if it were not for Stalin being there and his strong leadership. And I simply want to see him honored more and more. I know we recently had a statue restored because it had been taken down in the metro. I think one of the metros near Red Square. But I just want to see his name invoked more. I want to see the honor. I would love to see the government itself. And I know it's divisive. So, you know, every individual needs to decide, knowing that your people are divided. But I really think the truth needs to come out, because after Stalin's death, you know, we got Khrushchev, but then we did get Brezhnev and we got Andropov. They didn't really continue that anti-Stalin, that de-Stalinization, but neither did they rebuke the lies that have been said. That would have gone far. I'm still waiting to see that happen to some degree. That's not to say there were not things that happened and repressions that happened, but a lot of those, and we'll do a show on that sometime, are not directly because of Stalin. That is an entire, from the very beginnings, you know, going back to, you know, the beginnings, which is an interesting topic to see how the Bolsheviks grew. It's a wonderful story, actually. But I'd have to say that all of that cannot and will not, is not what we should focus upon. Is the good that Stalin did, and recognize we would not have Russia today had it not been for him. We needed that strength. We needed that government. We needed the strength that we see in Russia to survive the disgusting what happened in the late 80s and 90s, but still the strength of the people that were there to be able to recover that, and through Putin's wise leadership to recover. But I still think that inherent strength came because it was there in ruined the country because of Stalin's leadership. I just want to see that more and more recognized. And it begins with you and me, sharing what we know, dispelling the lies completely with the facts, because we owe him gratitude. The entire world, if you care about justice, if you care about freedom, and those words are thrown around in the United States, and they are meaningless in the United States, frankly. But they had meaning in the Soviet Union, and they have meaning in the Russian Federation. And that is why the truth about Stalin is so important to share.
Ostensibly were the victims of Stalin, don't see themselves as victims, right? So when Stalin is number one in all the polling data, and number two is tax on these great leaders, fall flat when you realize that the people that actually, were subject to their leadership were quite happy with it, quite fond of it, and they these are the two most revered leaders in Russian history. And then we talk about the legacy. I mean, the legacy is tremendous, and it's impossible to overstate, what the Soviet Union meant to humanity, because so many of the benefits that we received in the West were a result of this ideological competition, and the capitalist West, the oligarchs, being forced to give concessions and make reforms to the workers in order to make the case that no, capitalism is better for the workers than socialism is. And so, for instance, the right to vote in the Soviet Union for women happened before it happened in the United States, and so the United States was forced to make these kinds of reforms, to be progressive. And so it was the Soviet Union forcing progress on humanity. And unfortunately, we haven't progressed enough, right? Because we still have oligarchy. We still have the rule of the pedophilic elite class. And that's what needs to, that's what the Russians managed to overcome in the Soviet Union. That's what China has managed to overcome. But the West is still dominated by these corrupt oligarchies. And so that's the progress that we need to really, see come about. And unless we understand the history and the reality of the Soviet Union and what they accomplished for humanity, it's hard for people to understand what's going on. I do see a question.
Okay.
What is this? How is Stalin better or worse than Prince Vlad? So I think he's talking about Putin, perhaps.
Better or worse? Is that the question? Is that the question?
That's what he's asking. Yeah.
Okay. Well, better or worse? I would just say that sometimes there comes a loaded question, but with all respect to the question, I mean, I think it's a good question, but it's still sort of loaded. I could not say better, and I could not say worse. I am going to say that both of these men are fine leaders. Stalin was a fine leader. Putin is a fine leader. He's not communist, but he does meet with the Communist Party. I frequently read. I would recommend to persons if you're interested. I love Russia, so I'm just very interested in just the day-to-day everything that is going on politically and economically and otherwise socially. But he routinely meets with them. They are taken into consideration. I've even seen decisions that Putin was influenced, that the Communist Party met with him, that they wanted, and they're doing that right now on some of the matters, and I think in regards to the home ownership and mortgages. So he does listen, and I would go back to Stalin listened. I would say there's so many similarities in terms of the character, the integrity of the man. I look at the simplicity of life, the austerity that Stalin lived with. Well, I would have to say, of course, Putin has his wealth developed from very early on the investments that were legally done at that whole change in which the West was pressing upon the Russian Federation at the time. and simply took advantage of that, as many other people did. But still, I take a look at his apartment in the Kremlin, for example, and it could be so much more. And it's very simple. It would remind me of the life of anyone getting an apartment in Moscow. I would say there's no ostentatiousness. There is no focus upon at the expense of others at all. I believe that Putin truly loves the Russian people and is doing in this time and age, and with who he is and his entire past behind him, making the decisions that he feels is in the best interest of the Russian people. And I believe at all times Stalin did the same. The background that he had, who he was, and the circumstances he found himself in at that point of history, I believe he made the decisions that to him seemed to be the best that he could do out of love for the people. So there's no better or worse in that sense. I would say I love reading so much of Stalin, both from the very earliest years, the development of the Bolsheviks, as well as later. I know that Putin has made references through the years, much more, I would say, in the early years in regards to Stalin. So he's obviously, read and even has made mention of reading some of Stalin's personal notes. That really pleases me. I like to think of Putin reading more of Stalin, especially as the Russian Federation, its economy grows and decisions to be made, because I think there's so much to be learned from and implemented today. As we see some of the economic pressures and difficulties that people are facing that they have not faced before. But I believe that both men loved the people and did the best that they could, are doing, and Putin's doing the best that he can. But if you love the people, then I think that ultimately the best decisions, you're going to learn from the mistakes, you're going to correct the mistakes. But overall, the people are going to be blessed because you're the leader. The people certainly were blessed by Stalin, and the people of today are blessed to have Putin. So that's the only type of quote comparison I can say.
I think Putin, well, I mean, he might be the first military leader since Stalin, to engage in, a large military action. I mean, you could argue Afghanistan, but he's prosecuting the war very similarly, right? He has concern for the troops. I remember, they've at great expense, they have taken a bunch of children and from the conflict zone, and then of course the West seizes on that and pretends like it's some kind of evil thing. And also just not wanting to harm civilians. They're as the Ukrainians kind of indiscriminately attack civilians and do all these terrorist activities. Putin is focusing his military on military targets. So, I see a lot of similarities there. And it's also, ideologically, like I would, obviously as a communist, I would, it would be nice to have an outright communist leadership in Russia. But the thing is, it probably wouldn't be for the best, because, a lot, there is a division in Russia. And you need a manager. You need somebody who can, manage other factions and bring them together. And that's really what Putin is great at. And so it's probably a benefit that he's not, an overt communist. It probably helps him. But I do, as a communist, I like the idea of appealing to humanity and appealing to the working class, and the shared interests of the masses, the working class masses. And so sometimes when Putin references the Russian people, I'm like, I wish he wasn't so Russian people specific, but I know that he needs to do that because he's the leader of Russia, and he needs to appeal to that nationalism, and a lot of Russians aren't communists, so he can't really have that international pitch that Stalin had.
Two things there from what you said. First, great observation. about the caring, the protection of the children. Most certainly, there's been no kidnapped children, all this nonsense from the West. On the contrary, there were children whose lives were saved and whose parents asked the Russians to take them and protect them. So, that's just a bunch of nonsense. There's absolutely nothing to that at all. But Stalin always said, and I'm paraphrasing, but numerous people said, we are, as we progress, liberators in this war. We're not conquerors. We are liberators. We're not here, to avenge against these people, but to help these people. And that is, of course, what Putin is doing in the Ukraine, liberating people, and people are grateful to be liberated from the fascist Ukrainians. Also, in reference to what you said, and how you view Putin, there are times that when I'm reading certain pieces from Stalin, I wish I could just circle it, let's say. I mean, I'm not in this position. And it was like, I wish that, Putin could read this and consider it in certain decisions. I mean, I deeply appreciate Putin completely. He saved Russia. Okay. I know that, just as Stalin saved the Soviet Union. But I would say that just as Stalin evolved, Putin is evolving. And as a country, Russia is evolving. And I actually love the way that he speaks to the Russian people when you were talking about the nationalism, because when we're talking about the Russian people, we're talking about everyone, over 100 ethnicities. And right now, this is the year of unity in Russia. And I listened to Putin's speech several days ago, about a week ago. And it was really beautiful because there is a respect for all the ethnicities and all of the recognized religions. And then the one thing that we share, we keep that individuality of who we are, and we celebrate that, and we appreciate that about those who differ from us. But fundamentally, the one thing we share is we are Russian. And I don't find that a contradiction at all. I actually feel that in a sense of unity, the way that a country should be unified. So I love that about him, actually. But yeah, sometimes I see a passage that I just think, and I have no way of knowing, has he considered, as we're just looking at things, especially economically right now, which, but I know he knows more than I do, and those around him. And I'll just say that as the Soviet people, and the Soviet leaders trusted Stalin. I, as someone who completely loves Russia, that is for me my spiritual homeland and motherland. I know that to be a fact. I have only deep appreciation and trust in Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, they're very lucky that he is in charge at this really crazy time. And I think, we might be in for, years of conflict. And yeah, they're very fortunate that Putin is in a position of leadership. And it looks like we gave the questioner too much credit. It looks like he was asking us to draw a comparison between Vlad the Impaler and Stalin. So he was just being silly. But I think the way we answered it was way better than his question that was asked. Now we have Jennifer is asking about a book, and so you can please tell me about if any books that you have out. But I know you have a new website, and so we can anybody can link to the website. It's in the description of this video, and so check her work out there. But any books on this topic?
Mine, what I would be really glad to do, Jennifer, and thank you for the question. I don't know if you're asking about myself. I've written a few books, but they are not on this topic. But I do invite, and Jennifer, if you want to be in touch with me, if you would like personally some recommendations of books in regards to what we've been discussing today, or anything related to the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation or Stalin himself, feel free just to email me, and I'd be glad to. But thank you for asking. My books are not about Stalin, although I feel so much that I've learned, but there's plenty of good books out there. I would like to invite everyone to my new website, and I've had a few websites over the years, but this site is new, And what's there is selected work from the past few years and more to come. You'll find some of my essays and my thoughts on a range of topics, and you can certainly contact me through there. And my new website just actually launched this week. Just created it anew. Is historianoftruth.com. Again, that's historianoftruth.com. I do have a piece that's more stream of consciousness regarding Joseph Stalin. I also have a piece recently written that I transferred to my new website about social murder. And I would really invite everybody to read that. I think it's a very important topic that people consider about our country. And that term from Ingalls, we briefly discussed it in one of our previous shows. I think one of your listeners was very interested in that. But there's information, a lot of essays, and my personal thoughts at historianoftruth.com. And Jennifer, if you have any other questions, feel free to email me, and that goes for anyone in our audience.
And you can access that website. She did write a great essay on Stalin about a year ago, a little less than a year ago. And so check that out on her website. And the link is in the description of this video. Christine, are we ready to wrap up? It's been a good hour.
I think it has been a good hour as well, Billy Bob. I'm glad we touched on some of these personal anecdotes about Stalin. I think it says a lot about a person to know how they are in private, essentially, that we're talking about. And we will address all of those falsehoods and the big lies about Stalin in the show in itself. But those are easily dispelled with the facts. And as a historian, truth is my highest priority. And no matter what I address, I'm always questioning. I've always questioned myself at any given time in my life, year by year, who I am, what I believe. And I'm always searching, and I usually go for my research very deep into archivals, collections, as well as the NKVD and the CIA. A lot of my work, a lot of that which I have learned are from others' memoirs, as well as studying the numbers. I would like to recommend, you can find this recommendation on my website when you go to my essay, The True Stalin, there. I have to recommend the work of Professor Grover Furr, F-U-R-R, in regards to Stalin. Those big lies in regards to the falsehood that, of the Holodomor, the falsehood of the mistreatment and mass mistreatment and executions and the numbers, all of that. This man has devoted himself to a wealth of knowledge from his books, and there is a link to his Amazon page. He has a personal website as well. I strongly recommend people check out Grover Furr, and there's other links on there as well. But yeah, I think we've covered a lot that's very important. And take what you know, take what you learn, what you've come and now believe in regards to Stalin, the Soviet Union, and have the courage to share it with someone. You never know when you're going to have that opportunity, but don't remain silent. It's very important that the truth of our past and the history and the great accomplishments of Stalin in the Soviet Union are remembered with gratitude and with reverence and with respect. And it's up to each of you to take what you learn and share it when the opportunity presents, because that opportunity will present.
And 1 hour is not long enough to get into everything. And so we will continue to meet every other Friday. And like we said earlier, we're going to have, more discussions about Stalin, the lies, and focus on the lies. But there's just so much there. So Christine, thank you so much. We will reconvene I'll see you again the Friday after next. And thank you everyone for watching.